I am not going to enjoy this video. There are very few certainties in this life. Death and taxes, and the other certainty is this: Fred is the most scariest, most horrifying film you'll ever watch. It is so horrifying that I'm going on record now and saying, don't watch it. It is, of course, the infamous 1984 apocalyptic horror film written by Barry Hines and directed by Mick Jackson. Yes, that Mick Jackson, the one who directed Bodyguard. If you haven't seen the film, in a nutshell, it is the build-up to a nuclear attack, the nuclear attack itself, and then the immediate and long-term aftermath of a nuclear attack on Sheffield. And it just goes on and on after the attack. It just drags you through this nuclear wasteland in just the most horrifying fashion. It was an Anglo-Australian production with the BBC and Network 9 Australia, and had a tiny budget. It was made for 400 grand, which is just absolutely, I mean, they make episodes of stuff for Netflix now with budgets of like $6 million and things like that. So it was set in a contemporary 1984 usual world setting, nothing really happening, but there's something going on in the background. There's this sort of tension building up in the Middle East. It follows Ruth, which I suppose would be the main character of the film, and her boyfriend Jimmy. They have an unplanned pregnancy and plan to marry. They both come from sort of different backgrounds. Ruth is quite middle class and Jimmy's very working class. And as the plot moves forwards, we start to see the wider families being introduced to it, but you don't really get to know them. You don't really get to know any characters within this film. All of the build-up to the nuclear conflict in the film takes place in the background. It's very matter-of-fact-ish kind of thing. It's sort of, you'll hear a news report in the background in one scene, and in another scene somebody will be reading a newspaper. From what I can ascertain, the events that lead to nuclear war, it's something to do with Iran and a Russian-backed coup in the country and the American military intervening. So we see that a limited nuclear exchange occurs between the Americans and the Soviet Union in Iran, when the Americans issue an ultimatum and the Russians ignore it. So the Americans send a force of B-52 bombers in to bomb the Russian base. The Russians respond by launching a nuclear-tipped ground-to-air missile and destroying the bomber force. So in retaliation, the Americans launch a tactical nuclear weapon and destroy the Russian base. This alone would just be a horrifying situation. The amount of death and destruction from these two nuclear warheads would just be absolutely devastating to the globe. But the film carries on and the gears of war continue turning. We are led towards nuclear conflict at an ever-increasing pace, and this all occurs in the background. You're still focusing primarily on Ruth and Jimmy. We start to see as well in the background of the story changes happening to people's day-to-day lives, like the price of a tin of beans has doubled and people panic buying goods from the shops and buying out all the lumber from the local lumber yard to build shelters. That kind of thing is happening. But also within that, you can start to see Britain's preparedness for the event happening as well. You can start seeing government continuity plans being put into action. At this point, we're then introduced to the leader of Sheffield City Council, who has started to assemble his team for his war cabinet, and they are building a shelter directly beneath the town hall. As the tensions increase between the Soviet Union and the West, the war starts getting ever worse and fighting does eventually start. All the while we're following the mundane lives of Jimmy and Ruth, but tension is starting to show on them. They've bought themselves a flat to live with each other in their married life with their baby for the future they're expecting to have. They're stripping the wallpaper from the flat, and Ruth just breaks down in tears. She can't take the tension of these constant news reports and stuff. So what the film does is it draws you in this really kind of tight focus on these two individuals, and it breaks it up with these splatters across the screen of information, like typed information comes across the screen. This is a really effective way of providing exposition for the viewer, because remember, this isn't a film in the traditional sense. This is what we class as a docudrama. So more tensions are arising all in the background. People are preparing for nuclear conflict, but not really taking it 100% seriously. There tends to be, I think in this country, we've kind of got this image of war that we take from the Blitz of London and the bombing of Coventry and things like that, where we sort of think that, don't worry, we can take it, everything will be all right. In a nuclear war, nothing will be all right, ever. We start seeing more and more of a military build-up happening. We see the British government taking over the control of all the cross-channel ferries, for instance, in order to transfer troops onto the continent to reinforce soldiers fighting there. We see the government also take over British Airways for the same reason. Jimmy and Ruth carry on as normal. Jimmy even finds time to go down the pub with his mate who he ain't seen in a while, and they're discussing the war and how they're going to handle it, and they're just going to get blottoed when the bomb goes off and all that kind of stuff, all that kind of gallows humour, I suppose. Yeah, at the same time though, in the background, we start seeing Britain is transitioning to a war economy. For instance, the Emergency Powers Act 1964 has been enacted, and that includes things like limiting the amount of cash that can be drawn out of your bank account, subtle things like that, rationing, the internment of known subversives, and the removal of firefighting equipment out to safe locations. And then it's Tuesday, and it's 8:30 in the morning. People are just going about their business, they're getting ready to go to work, because in them days Sheffield was a big industrial town, loads of steel mills and everything like that there. Charlie Brooker of Black Mirror fame once said of Threads that if Threads has got a general theme to it, it'd be, oh shit! But it's 8:30 in the morning, and that's important, because that means it's 3:30 in the morning in Washington. And if it's 3:30 in the morning in Washington, it means NATO's reaction to any attack will be at its slowest. And not for the last time in this video, I'm about to say, and then things got worse. So the nuclear exchange begins in earnest now. We're now in full-on apocalyptic, mutually assured destruction territory. It starts off with a large nuclear explosion over the North Sea. This is done because the electromagnetic pulse from a nuclear explosion would just disable all the lines of communication throughout Northern Europe. Before this initial nuclear explosion, however, attack warning red is transmitted, and we start seeing the kind of what the film has as its sort of official government response to the crisis element in Sheffield Town Hall. They all just go bananas, they're all bricking it, and quite rightly so. Radios are blown up and all sorts of things happen in that shelter while everyone is panicking. And as the viewer, I'm going to warn you, if you do decide to watch this film, this scene, the next few minutes of this, the next 10 minutes of this film are some of the most harrowing scenes you'll ever have the misfortune to view. But they ain't the worst element of this film. So with attack warning red comes the UK's infamous 4-minute warning, which culturally, if you're not from the UK, it probably won't seem significant to you. But the 4-minute warning did seep into many elements of British popular culture. I mean, there was an entire episode of Only Fools and Horses, for instance, a British sitcom. It's the greatest sitcom of all time, actually. was centred around this whole concept of having 4 minutes to get to shelter. With Sheffield being an industrial centre, it was a prime target. A few miles down the road from Sheffield was an RAF base, RAF Finningley, I think it was called. That is struck first in the film, and we see just a harrowing montage of people panicking. You see Jimmy in his building lumberyard running frantically to his car to get to the roof. This is the last time we see Jimmy in the entire film, by the way. His fate is left open. You don't know whether he dies or not. I personally assume that he did. Actually, for this bit here, I think I'm just going to put some cat video up while I explain what happens in the film. But what makes this part of the film so harrowing is that it's not Jimmy's fate that terrifies you. Jimmy's seen jumping into his car, and there's some sounds of panic and stuff in the background, and actually off screen you can hear a baby crying, which I think explains his motives. He's trying desperately to get to the roof and their unborn child. I actually found that quite hard, that moment, when I heard the baby crying. You then get to see one of the most iconic moments of the film when you see the businesswoman pissing herself in her business suit as she sees this mushroom cloud rising up from the outskirts of the city. And then things get worse. We then see the third nuclear warhead strike. It strikes Tinsley Viaduct. And Tinsley Viaduct is a large motorway junction just on the outskirts of Sheffield. It's in between Sheffield and Rotherham, and it's got a power plant right next to it. It's this warhead that destroys Sheffield and absolutely devastates the place. It's actually filmed quite well on the budget. What we see a mixture of stock footage, and we see a mixture of actual real world explosions and buildings being blown up. I think at the time Sheffield Council was demolishing a large estate in the city, and they just said to the production crew, yeah, have at it, kind of thing. So it's, for the budget again of £400,000, it is probably the most effective filmmaking I've ever seen, because it is terrifying. It is utterly unflinching. It doesn't look away from it. You've been drawn in to this film with this sort of kitchen sink soap opera-ish kind of plot so far, and it is being violently torn away from you. There is no comfort to be had anywhere in this film. People say there's a moment of brevity in the film where during the attack scene, one of the people it focuses on is a man sitting on the toilet having an early morning dump, and he just says, oh bloody hell, as the sirens go off, and they remark that it's the typically British way of dealing with that kind of crisis. It's not. That is not a moment of brevity. That is absolutely terrifying. That is metaphorical. That is metaphorical for a civilization that is unprepared for the devastation that's being wrought on it. Metaphorically speaking, humanity has been caught with its pants down. This section of the film goes on for 10 whole minutes, and it is 10 minutes of people dying, people burning, people dying in just the most ways you wouldn't even imagine they're dying in a nuclear explosion, like just crashing their cars, for instance, or having bricks falling on them and things like that. It takes away any image you've got in your mind beforehand of what a nuclear war would look like and the survivability of such a war. One of the splashes comes across the screen and it says, in total, worldwide, 3,000 megatons have fallen. That's just shocking when you think that the devastation to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, those was a few tens of kilotons. Of that 3,000 megatons that fall globally though, it's estimated that 210 of those megatons lands on Great Britain. We get more exposition on the screen as well, like it's splashed across little bits of information like firefighters being withheld to preserve their equipment. But the main exposition we get about the government response is sort of encapsulated in the Sheffield City Council thread of the film, and they are subsequently now buried under the remains of the town hall. And here again we see the subtlety in the horror of this film, in that the leader of the city council just offhandedly mentions this area here on the map, are people safe there? And his scientist says to him, no, they'll all be dead because there's been a ground burst at Crew and that's just spreading radiation in that direction. They're going to get a lethal dose of radiation within the hour. The area he was pointing to was where his house was, and he's thinking about his wife and children. Within hours of the attack happening, cohesion is already being lost. There's hardly any communication and there's hardly any resources left. You hear this in lines of dialogue and arguments that are happening in the background and everything, but the focus shifts primarily onto Ruth again at this point. Her and her family and her elderly relatives are in the basement of their home, their shattered and destroyed home. We do go back and see Jimmy's parents. Jimmy's mum has been mutilated beyond recognition by the attack. Half her face is gone. She's just been burnt so horrifically. They're in a improvised shelter in the basement of their home as well. Nothing more is heard of Jimmy's younger sister, who was sent down the shops for some milk as the attack happened, literally seconds before she went out the door. And his younger brother was out in the backyard because he collected racing pigeons and he was with them when he died. The pacing of the film doesn't actually pick up at this point, but the speed of history picks up at this point. So now we now skip a month, and in that time Sheffield City Council have all suffocated to death in their bunker. Now I have heard other YouTubers discussing their actions while I was in that bunker and making it like an analogy for British imperialism almost, the way that they seem very callous in the way that they are managing food supplies, for instance. I don't think it's that. I actually think it's more a case of they are trying to show what the British official response to this would be, and however callous it may be, this is continuity of government. When you're faced with annihilation on this level, what is the government's job? Well, the government's job is to keep the nation itself as an entity, not the population. Although they do have a duty to the population, hence all the extent they go to acquire food and work and rebuild with them. But the primary job itself is to preserve the nation as an entity. By doing that, you must preserve the government as an entity, the functioning government. That's what continuity of government is about, and that's what they are displaying here in these sections of the film. We then come across possibly one of the most harrowing things ever put to film, even within threads. This bit is hard to watch, and I've seen other YouTubers say they elect not to watch this part of the film because it is so horrifying, and I agree with them. I actually really didn't want to make this video because I didn't want to rewatch the film, and this part of the film is really bad. It's the hospital scene, the infamous hospital scene. And what this scene is showing is, in Britain we are advised to spend 2 weeks in your improvised shelter, and then you can emerge and things will be hopefully start all getting back to normal. We can have a nice cup of tea. What it actually shows though in this film, again ripping away any comfort blanket we may have stitched together during the Blitz, is it shows the futility of that, and it shows the horror of that situation. So as I mentioned, 2 weeks, spend 2 weeks in the shelter as we're advised to, and we then emerge from the shelter and we seek the medical attention that we need. And the hospital scene is harrowing in that it focuses so tightly on the gore and the horror of it, and these thousands of people that are injured attending a hospital which is overwhelmed. There are no medical supplies left. You see the doctors and the nurses ripping up sheets to make bandages. You see them using cooking salt in water to sanitize their hands. You see them amputating limbs with a hacksaw he got out of B&Q's just before the bomb went off. It is horrific, but just so believably realistic. God, I hate that film. I hate that film with vengeance. The things that film has done to my head, you have no idea. In this part of the film, Ruth is looking for Jimmy. She's been and visited the ruins of his house and found his mum dead in the basement, and she takes away one item from the house. She takes away a book on pigeons, on tropical birds or something, as a memento of him. She then starts her journey across this wasteland, and again we're seeing the response to this crisis and what's happening to the people and the descent into barbarism that happens. We see iconic moments where people are rioting for food and the British Army are shooting these hungry rioters, and we see one of the most iconic images of the film. It's like, it's how they advertised the film, with this image of a traffic warden armed with his face bandaged up where he's been injured. We swiftly see the deaths of Jimmy's father, for instance. His mum's died in the shelter. She's died of radiation sickness, and the dad has tried to keep her alive. He goes to use the tap in the kitchen, and a bunch of gungy black water comes out of it, and by the time he manages to get a bowl to it, it's run out. And that's a theme throughout the film. This constant lack of resources. And then things got worse. So remember, Ruth's pregnant, and she's travelling across the Buxton countryside trying to find shelter. She gets put in a billet, and then the old man that owns the house chucks her out. She's then seen on the moors with Jimmy's friend, and they're eating a dead sheep kind of thing, hoping it's not radioactive. She then has the baby on her own in a barn, and she's forced to cut the cord with her bare teeth. Again, I found that scene just so hard to watch. We then see her being forced to prostitute herself for food, for 4 dead rats she sells herself for. We see the effects of radiation on the countryside. It's the first film to actually show the effects of a nuclear winter off on the globe. However, the YouTuber Niall Holloran actually done a really good video about nuclear winter, which I really urge you to seek out and watch, because it explains the science of it a lot better than I ever could. At some point as well in the film, we see Jimmy's father actually dying after he's traded some cigarettes for some whiskey, which he can't even take because the radiation sickness he's coming down with. And I would actually argue it's those smaller scenes with these other side characters which dump a lot more exposition onto the film than Ruth's story, because it's quite apparent that what's left of the British government is quite happy to let people die. It actually says that explicitly in the film. The more people that die, the less mouths there are to feed, the more food there is for everyone else. We then jump to 10 years after the war, and we see a 10-year-old with Ruth, and it's her daughter that she's had in the barn, and they're working the fields, but they're really covered up with loads and loads of garments, and their eyes are covered up and everything. And this is because of the damage to the ozone layer. It's dangerous to be outside. Ruth is, at this point, prematurely aged. She's half blind with cataracts, and she's got some sort of unspecified illness. And she collapses while working. We do see other little bits of her and the child. We see bits where the child's learning, and she's nothing's ever said. They don't speak, but they're watching a video that's totally irrelevant to them, and they're then seen working on, ironically enough, removing garments, like threads from garments for reuse. When Ruth dies, her daughter Jane sort of doesn't really show any emotion about it at all. It's quite apparent that the children of this war are very emotionally stunted and things like that. A lot of people seem to think it's to do with damage from radiation and that they're quite mentally challenged, these children, and everything like that. I don't think it's that. I think it's more of the fact that society has been just so badly damaged by this war. The threads of our civilization have all been cut, that people just don't speak to each other that much anymore, whether it be adults that are just so utterly traumatized from the loss, or children just not knowing how to communicate with each other. It is one of the more subtle elements of the film, actually, in that one of the biggest threads that binds us together as a civilization is our ability to talk to one another and communicate. And that thread has been cut in this film. We've descended into barbarism. Children of this war don't really talk, and when they do talk, it's single words. It's not really sentences. It's like very, very young children talking to each other. So we're now following Jane, and this is important to the climax of the film. So as I mentioned, Jane is quite cold emotionally, and she doesn't really communicate well. In the background, we are seeing signs of some industry returning, but things are still short. Jane and two other boys go out and steal some food, for instance, so that to me says that food is still quite rare, and one of the boys is shot for stealing the food. So we're clearly in a state of emergency. And then what happens is the script says Jane and the other boy have crude intercourse. Now I'm highlighting that because a lot of other YouTubers seem to think that it's a rape. It's not. It's, again, the director showing that the levels of barbarity that we're descending into. Next we see of Jane is she's visibly pregnant and she's stumbling into a hospital to have her baby. And again, we can infer that civilization is recovering slightly because we're seeing a little bit of machinery. There's electric lights in the hospital. And then things get worse because now we're at the climax of the film, and it is probably one of the most iconic moments of British television history. Jane having her baby. This is Ruth and Jimmy's grandchild, and Jane is 13, and she gives birth, and the baby is silent and not moving, and it's handed to her. And when she gazes into the eyes of her child, one of the most magical moments a human can possibly have. So Jane gazes on the baby and starts to scream, but before the scream can leave her mouth, the credits roll. Now, a lot of people will say about threads how scary it is because of technical reasons about how the film is made and how it dwells on this and that it doesn't show that and that it tells that, and many other things that many other better YouTubers will do better than me. But what I find most scary about threads isn't all of that that's been well said by a lot of other YouTubers. The terrifying thing to me about threads is that in reality it would be worse. So now I'm going to give you a little bit of background to threads. Now I've explained it in great detail to you. So threads was made in 1984, where the Cold War was looking to get quite hot. In actual fact, it was shown to President Reagan, and there's anecdotal evidence to show that him viewing this film led to him and his government entering talks on nuclear reduction with the Soviet Union. But threads came off of the back of a BBC documentary called QED, A Guide to Armageddon. It was released in 1983. It's available on YouTube. Go and watch it, because what it does is it does all of the stuff that threads does, but it explains it all to you scientifically. It explains the effects of a nuclear bomb going off over London. It's a single megaton nuclear device going off 1 mile above London, and it explains in detail the effects that would happen after that, the immediate effects and the immediate after effects. But then what it does is it goes on to explain the type of injuries that can be expected and how far away, for instance, you'd have to be from it to not get full thickness burns. Or it will explain to you with the example of a ballerina falling not quite right, that a impact of 8 miles an hour is enough to break a bone, and when a bomb goes off like that, you can expect overpressures and winds of up to 250 miles an hour or something. And amongst that radioactive wind would be the wreckage and debris of all of the buildings that is demolished on its way through to you. It also does experiments with real couples going through what at the time was the official government advice on protecting your home and yourselves from a nuclear device. For instance, they get a young couple that are living in Finsbury Park, which is 4 miles away from where the blast would have happened, and they dig a fallout shelter in their garden, and they put doors up against walls with mattresses on them and things like that to experiment on how that would work, and it is just an utter failure. It makes a mockery of all this government advice. So Mick Jackson, the director, consulted with many scientists, many politicians, even Carl Sagan got a phone call from him to talk about nuclear winter and everything like that. So the research was there for that. He had also worked on this Guide for Armageddon programme. But there's a reason I say things would be worse. So by the fact that you've watched Threads or on this video, I'm going to assume that you've heard of the man who saved planet Earth, Stanislav Petrov, his name is. He's a Russian colonel that one night in 1983 on his radar screen saw what looked like several dozen American nuclear missiles flying at the Soviet Union, but checked his instruments, maintained a cool head and ascertained that no, this wasn't an American attack, and said, everybody stand down. But let's look at the big picture of that. Why was Stanislav Petrov on high alert that night? Well, it's simple. What was happening at the time was a NATO command post exercise called Able Archer 83, and it was a simulation of a build-up to a nuclear conflict. It was basically all the heads of government heading for shelters, and generals and military personnel worldwide being shifted around into a nuclear war footing. And it was against that backdrop that the Soviet Union that night made the right choice. They was utterly up against it at this point in the Cold War. They was panicking. Ronald Reagan had them on the ropes at this point of the Cold War. They was doing things like on a regular basis, flying nuclear armed bombers straight up against Russian airspace and turning around at the last minute. He had them right on edge. And that night, Stanislav Petrov made the right decision. Why am I mentioning this though? Why am I talking about Able Archer 83 in the same video as Fred's? Stanislav Petrov, where does it all connect? And what's my point? How is this me arguing that Fred's would be so much more worse in real life? Well, as part of Operation Able Archer 83, the British government also conducted its own exercise called Operation Square Leg. Now, Operation Square Leg was a British government simulation of an attack on Great Britain. However, it was flawed. For instance, towns like Eastbourne were targeted with a large megaton nuclear warhead, whereas Whitehall and Greater London wasn't. There was industrial targets that wasn't hit, whereas little fishing villages were. And this is where I'm coming to the point. Threads and the official government response in Threads was based on the findings of Operation Square Leg. But again, the question remains, and another YouTuber did say this, he said, why do you watch horror films? Do you want to be horrified? And the answer to that is actually no. You don't want to be horrified by a film. You want to be thrilled by it. You want to be able to put on Netflix late at night or something where it's dark outside and watch The Shining, for instance, or Blair Witch maybe. But you don't actually want to be horrified. You don't actually want to feel real fear. But Threads does that to you. Threads really scares you like that. I mean, When I first saw Threads, I saw it in 2004. It was repeated on UK television and I happened to see it. And that night I was due to go to a party around a friend's house. I was only 18, friend's house down the road, little house party going. I couldn't go to the party. I had to sit indoors. I had to go and sit with my parents in the living room and calm my ass down after watching that. It robs you of any sense of normalcy, of any sense of routine. You find yourself despairing after watching it, and it's a feeling that lingers and it haunts you for weeks after watching it, before you start feeling any sort of semblance of normality. My partner watched it not long ago and it just traumatised her. My niece, she's only 19, 20, she watched it and she describes it as just the scariest thing she's ever seen in her life. And she actually went so far as to make a YouTube video about it and about what her grandparents, my parents, felt like during the Cold War. And that's another point, because you do find yourself talking to older relatives actually after watching it and going, well, what did you think when you first saw it? And a lot of them turn around and go, I didn't watch it. You know, it was just life for us at the time. But then the conversation gets into it and you start talking to them about, well, what did you think of the Cold War? And I found out my dad planned to run off and join the Navy, so he didn't have to face any nuclear bombs and all that. And my mum always says, like, she always imagined she'd be on the phone to my granddad. As soon as the 4-minute warning went, she'd bring her dad. I haven't the heart to tell her that she wouldn't be able to do that, because as part of the Emergency Powers Act 1964, the British government would close off all telephone lines. I think that is the theme to Threads. Yeah, you've got all of the stuff that's going on, the subtext of it, and the general message of the threads of our civilization breaking down from everything from the physical things we need to live in an urbanised society, like dustbin collectors and firemen and people that stock the shelves in the supermarket, down to the real important things that link us together, like family, for instance, friendship, even the ability to talk. And then at the very end of it, it takes away hope from you, because the fate of Jane's baby in it, this stillborn monstrosity, which you don't actually see, you're left to assume that it's a complete monster she's been given birth to because of the levels of radiation she's been exposed to over her lifetime. Another thing though that makes the film just terrifying is, as I mentioned before, it was all based on Operation Square Leg. But again, let's break this down. Nuclear missiles don't just carry one warhead, and it's never one warhead per city. It's dozens. If they was to bomb London, it'll be Heathrow, Gatwick, Whitehall, it'll be power stations, it'll be the Docklands, it'll be the City of London itself. It'll be telephone and internet exchanges and all that kind of stuff that'll get hit. What we see in the initial bombing, yeah, it's 210 megatons falling again, which is, I kind of disagree with. I think it'd be lower than that. I think the majority of the missiles will be in the high kiloton range, not the low megaton range. But we only see 3 bombs falling. Obviously, yeah, we know it's a all-out nuclear attack, and there's been many more off-screen. But the idea of just using 3 bombs on a city like Sheffield, that's inaccurate. That's not realistic. That is a very, very low estimate. That would be worse than that. There'll be dozens of bombs dropped on Sheffield. There'll be no survivors in Sheffield. There'll be no survivors in the UK in general. They say in the film that population levels dropped down to medieval levels, and that in the initial attack between 12 and 30 million people were killed outright. That's what is horrifying about it. The fact that it would be so much worse in real life. It's also often stated by people when they're talking about this film that we don't know who fired first. Well, I kind of disagree with that, because on the screen we see that splash that says it's 8:30 in the UK, 3:30 in Washington DC, the time when NATO reactions will be at their slowest. So I'm inferring from that the Soviet Union takes this opportunity to maximise their chances in this fight, which they see clearly as just inevitable at this point. So that's Threads, the scariest film ever made, the most horrifying film ever made. Again, I urge you not to watch it, because it will have an impact on you and you will be left with this feeling of trauma afterwards. And this isn't me being some sort of zoomer or something like that, not being able to handle my emotions. I'm spitting facts at you here. I actually, that night when I watched it and had to see my parents afterwards, which ain't like me at all, I had to ring my uncle up actually and go out for a game of snooker that lasted several hours while I cleared my head afterwards. But for all that, it is a very important film, and as I said, it had a direct impact on Ronald Reagan, for instance, and his nuclear stance. So it effectively helped save the world and win the Cold War, so it's important in that respect. As well as being on a budget of 400 grand, on a technical level, it is just excellent. The acting performances are strong, given the lack of pedigree, for want of a better word, of cast members within the show. Its use of exposition is very sparingly used. It is left down to you, the viewer, to infer stuff from it. It's one of them ones. It's a television play. You have to use your imagination a little bit with it. I encourage you not to do so. The only other film like it in a contemporary sense was The Day After, which was the American version that came out the year before. People criticised that film because it had big name stars in it and it lacked the kind of gravity of it, but it's just different storytelling. There's a different message from the film. In technical terms, it was probably superior. Its special effects had a lot more money to splash on them, so it was better in that sense. But again, Threads just makes such effective use of what little budget it had and the special effects it did have, and really, really economic editing as well. It is the superior film out of the two. I wouldn't recommend watching it and watching The War Game either, because The War Game is the 1964 film about nuclear war, which is very, very different. And although in parts it is as grim as Threads, there's this sort of certain glimmer of hope in that film, which Threads just completely is bereft of. There is no hope in Threads. I actually think the only other film that captures the kind of futility of it all and the horror of it all was a film from 2014 called War Book, which is basically 12 Angry Men about a nuclear war. It's a film and it's just set in one room. It's based on a play of the same name, and it is British government exercise taking place, so they're rehearsing a fictional nuclear war, and we've got a low-ranking minister in the room and several civil servants and an MP all debating in very much the same style as 12 Angry Men, but it does kind of capture the tension and you do get lost in it and you do start almost believing that this war could actually be the real deal. So it's worth checking out. Please give a like and subscribe if you can, because it really helps me out and it helps me with the algorithm and it helps me to make these films, because I do enjoy making videos on YouTube. And hey, I've actually done a bit of British science fiction for a change.